Just as an update, Stephen Harper, a conservative prime minister, brought in many reforms to the criminal justice system. To the 2012 Safe Streets and Communities Act was one of them. The protection of communities and exploited persons, which was in 2014, and tougher penalties for child predators, which was 2015. What Mr. Harper did in his government was created something called mandatory minimum sentences for a lot of criminal offenses. What this essentially meant was that regardless of who the person was in front of them, a judge had no discretion as to what penalty would be imposed. The mandatory minimum would apply, and the various principles of sentencing, such as rehabilitation, exercises of restraint, consideration of the specific needs of Indigenous people, were all ignored because of these mandatory minimums. Subsequent to Harper and his government falling, there's been movement in the Supreme Court of Canada to outlaw certain mandatory minimums, and also to attack the penalties which have been set out by Harper as being unconstitutional, as they violate specific rights. And this one paintbrush for all is simply not acceptable and doesn't work as a system. So Trudeau is also chipping away from his end. He's basically reduced 14 offenses where there were mandatory minimum penalties, and these include firearms and tobacco, and 6 drug offenses. Why this is critically important is it shows that the public still has an interest in seeing judges make the decision. The problem with mandatory minimum penalties is you're taking the discretion from the judges and putting it in the hands of politicians, and that unfortunately does not work in a lot of circumstances, as a lot of it is on the ground where politicians don't get to see the operation of communities where judges are entrenched. They get to see the offenders, they get to see how they're improving, and they also should be able to, from my perspective, determine the appropriate sentence. That's why mandatory minimum sentences don't work from my perspective, and why it's refreshing that the changes that Harper made in his tenure are being undone at this juncture in favor of sentences which allow for the judge to focus on the individual and make decisions which are appropriate for that individual. As an individual, sentencing is an individual process that's set out in the criminal code, and when legislators get into situations where they say, well, it might be individual, but not for this crime, not for that crime, this is when we run into significant problems and things have to stop. So that's just an update on some of the changes in the criminal code and changes in the way in which the courts are treating mandatory minimum sentences. And if you want more information, just give me a shout, mdlawgroup.ca. Thank you.